Hello and welcome.
By all appearances, this is an ordinary copy of Avengers #1 from 1963. It's a key issue in the early development of Marvel Comics. It's not the company's first team book. That would be the Fantastic Four. But the Avengers is the first team made up of superheroes from other Marvel titles. So it's an interesting acquisition. One could hardly complain about having it in their collection. However, this copy is not like other copies. How is it different? It's haunted. No, it isn't. That's just ridiculous. But there's something not quite right about it, and I had it for many years before I discovered exactly what that something was. At this point, I have to mention the following story is entirely based on memory. The details are clear in my mind, and I've tried my best not to misrepresent anything. But, as with any anecdote, I have to acknowledge these memories may be flawed or inaccurate. Other than actually owning a copy of the comic, I have zero evidence to support the following story. Disclaimer in place. Let's move forward. How I acquired Avengers #1 and the subsequent discovery I made about this copy begins somewhere around 1990 or 1991. This was the height of the speculator era, when comics had a high pop culture profile. Most back-issue prices were steadily climbing due to this attention, and anything from the Silver Age was very desirable. Generally speaking, I wasn't interested in investing. I was a collector. But first and foremost, I was a reader. If I didn't intend on reading a comic, I usually didn't buy it. There were exceptions, of course, but that was my standard rule. I originally went to the store in question because I was informed they had the first 2 issues of the inferior 5. My passion has always been for really stupid comics that no one is remotely interested in owning, or discussing for that matter, so these were comics I just had to have. I grabbed a run of early McFarlane Spider-Man comics I had lying around and decided to see if this store would be interested in a trade. These were comics I had reserved for an occasion such as this. At the store I saw they did have the 2 inferior 5 issues in question, so I pulled them off the wall, approached the counter, where the clerk and I negotiated a trade. While we were chatting, the clerk, let's call him Bob, asked if I was interested in other Silver Age stuff. Of course, I was. Bob then produced a copy of Avengers #1 and put it down in front of me. To be honest, I didn't really care. It wasn't the first copy I'd ever seen, so I wasn't overly impressed by it. And the Avengers isn't a team that interests me. I was not faking it or trying to be dismissive when I said it was nifty, but, I'll pass. Bob then made an offer I could not refuse. This Avengers #1, the 2 inferior 5 comics plus some cash, in exchange for the McFarlane Spider-Man comics. Now, I may have been a palooka from Hicksville, but I knew my stuff. I wasn't easily persuaded by high-pressure sales tactics, or insinuations that the deal was too good to pass up. I had been in this situation before, with a deal that was a bit too good to believe. Invariably, there was always something wrong with the comic being offered, like a page missing, or coupons cut out, or some defect that dramatically lowered its value. In other words, I was cautious. So I did my due diligence. I flipped through the entire comic to see if it was complete and genuine. The cover was faded with limited gloss, and that was its worst quality. I could see how a key issue like this would be difficult to sell to a serious collector. It wasn't desirable because it wasn't pretty. This was a showpiece giving one's collection a certain prestige, but it wasn't ever going to demand a high price. I remember the staples looking a bit too shiny, but the comic was complete. I could not see anything that indicated this wasn't the original comic in its original form, putting aside a possible replacement of the staples. I took the deal. I may not have cared that much for the Avengers, but it was classic Lee and Kirby. I knew that well into the future I could brag about owning it, even though it wasn't the prettiest girl at the party. Really, that was my only incentive in accepting the deal. I know it sounds a bit flippant and unrealistic, but I've always maintained that I would only collect what I really wanted. I rarely purchased anything that I thought of as an investment, which to me was all this was, a possible investment. But mostly, it was something to brag about. At home, I flipped through it again, and came to the same conclusion I had at the store. It was a legit copy of Avengers #1. It was complete and in reasonably good condition. Nowhere near perfect, though. The only other detail worth mentioning is the edges of the comic looked a bit too even. It was possible they had been trimmed to look more uniform. If this was the case, the person who did it did a very good job. It's a detail I didn't find too concerning. A few months pass. At the time, comic stores would report high-profile sales to price guides. It was something of a standard practice, so the medium worth of a comic could be determined. This way price guides, reputable ones anyway, could reflect the actual market worth of an issue. I saw the store listed in one of these guides, and the copy of Avengers I had acquired was listed in their recent sales. They mentioned the approximate grade and the price they had sold it for. This really sticks in my memory because it didn't mention the comic had been traded, not sold. Also, the listed selling price was higher than what I had allegedly paid for it. I found this quite interesting. Another important detail was also missing, one I wouldn't discover for quite some time. Now, we have to move forward about 15 years. A friend and I decided to share a table at a convention, and, for the first time, I decided to bring the Avengers comic with me. It was a showpiece after all. I remember throwing a slightly unrealistic price on it because I wasn't actually looking to sell it. I just wanted to show it off. A fair amount of people paused when they saw it and asked if they could hold it in their hands. I knew they weren't remotely considering it as a purchase. They just wanted to hold a piece of history, and I was cool with showing it off. However, there was one man who was very serious about buying it. We had a vaguely friendly conversation while he inspected it like I had many years previously. Then he said the words that shocked and surprised me. "Oh, this has been restored." Now, I hadn't actually examined this book since I originally acquired it. In fact, for the most part, it just sat in a box going completely ignored. In the passing years, the flaw I couldn't originally see became more and more apparent. As the gentleman pointed out, the interior of the cover and some of the pages had paper added to them. That is, in its original state, the cover would have been quite loose, and the pages would have been missing chunks along the spine. Someone had taken apart the comic, filled in those missing pieces, repaired the cover, and then stapled it back together. On closer inspection, it was very likely the cover and the interior pages had also been trimmed to make them look even. At that moment, I was more than a little dismayed. The gentleman had no interest in a restored copy, and when he left, I hid that comic behind the table. At home, after the convention, I went through the comic again. It just confirmed what the gentleman had pointed out. It was a restoration. It was irrefutable, really. I had a restored comic without being informed it was a restoration. This restoration was really good at the time I acquired it, practically flawless from what I remember. But over time, as the comic aged, the imperceptible differences became more and more apparent. The restored bits aged and discolored differently than the original pages. Also, there was a stiffness to the added bits. They weren't as flexible as the original pages. And now, years later, those differences were hard to miss. That stiffness and slight discoloration is quite pronounced. This realization triggered the memory of a persistent rumor I had heard about that store. Allegedly, the owner was someone who had a degree in restoration. This I had heard a few times and thought nothing of it. I mean, comic shops had the same level of brand loyalty, usually reserved for Marvel and DC. So when I heard this, I thought it was simply a few people throwing shade on a store they didn't like. Unfortunately, I had proof the rumors were possibly true. However, I have no actual evidence to support the claim that the restoration was done at that store by that owner. They may have genuinely purchased this comic and had been misled exactly like I was. I mean, Occam's razor suggests otherwise, but there is literally no proof to support any definitive conclusion. All I can say with certainty is this copy is genuine and complete. I've even compared all the pages to another copy of the same comic, and it's an exact match. It's an actual Avengers #1 from 1963. However, it has been restored. The exact amount of restoration is completely unknown. As such, the staples, the clean edges, and the spine, its entire original condition, is questionable, as is its actual worth. In the end, this is a cautionary tale, if anything. For those that may not know, in this day and age, restoration is a relatively common thing. The techniques have advanced over the years to the point where a good restoration is difficult to spot. It's arguable whether this is a deceptive practice or not. It's also arguable whether this is an effort to preserve history or to merely raise its desirability and its worth. Some also debate what constitutes a restoration. Is correcting a rolled spine or dry cleaning interior pages a harmless, non-invasive preservation or a restoration? Opinions vary. There's also a section of collectors that actively look for low-grade comics with the intention of utilizing some common, enhancing techniques to improve their value. Again, it's debated whether that's a shady aspect of the collector's market or not. Of course, due to my experience, I contend that any and all enhancements to the original condition of the comic should be mentioned up front, regardless of whether those improvements are considered restoration or not, or whether these improvements are noticeable under intense scrutiny, because, in my opinion, doing otherwise is dishonest. Personally, I can't complain too much. After all, I did get a complete copy of a key Silver Age comic for free, essentially. That's how I see it. I traded a bunch of meaningless comics for one I was ambivalent about and 2 others that I actually wanted. The basis of that exchange was potentially dishonest, but it's not something that weighs on me. Which leaves the question, would I have made the trade knowing it was a restoration? Maybe not. At the same time, I was coming out ahead with this trade. I was getting more than I initially expected, so I might have agreed even with that knowledge. Who knows, an alternate reality version of myself, say one from a collectible universe, 10 minutes into the future may have a different opinion. But in this universe, I'm good with how everything turned out. In the end, this isn't a complaint about being done dirty. Honestly, I don't feel that way. I was disappointed to learn it was a restoration, but I keep that in perspective. It was basically free, and in the process, I acquired 2 awesome comics that have stayed with me through the years.